Friends, as a new minister in our precious tradition, I am thrilled to get to preach this Sunday, this Martin Luther King Jr. Sunday. It is a Sunday we traditionally use as an opportunity to discuss and be in communion with the historical impact of Dr. King's legacy. And this year finds us in a stunningly different moment on the world stage, and I've struggled to find the right words to bring to you this morning. And I'm not alone. Ministers across the country have shared their struggle this week to find the right words. I have been repeatedly heartbroken over the ruthless treatment of our immigrant neighbors. And the events in the Twin Cities of Minnesota right now have been chaotic and anti-American, at least anti our highest American ideals. And far from what I know Dr. King would have hoped we would have achieved by now. In the UU tradition, our greatest aspirations, as I said earlier today, are to create beloved community, a term popularized by Reverend King. Beloved community is a society where all people are cared for, have opportunities and the freedom to flourish, where a true shalom, a true salam, which is more than just peace, it is thriving, is a reality for all people. It is what Jesus called the kingdom of heaven, and what we as Unitarian Universalists have historically held as our sixth principle, a global community with liberty and justice for all, which also, not so coincidentally, rings similarly to those words we recited every morning in schoolrooms with our hands over our hearts and our eyes fixed on the American flag. And given the state of things today, it can feel like we are nowhere near beloved community. But I know that that is not true. And I have not lost hope as I watch as people are bravely standing up for their neighbors, providing mutual aid, supporting each other, schools shutting down for the safety of their children and those children's grown-ups. Sentinels armed with whistles to alert for activity in the area. People opening their homes to protesters to give them a respite from the cold that I cannot even imagine in Minneapolis. The peaceful and persistent protests and care happening is reminding me that beloved community is in the spaces we create. And much like that call that King put out for clergy to come to Selma, there has been a call put out to clergy across the country to join together in Minneapolis next week. And as James Reeb and Viola Liuzzo, two Unitarian Universalists, one a minister and one a lay leader, they did not make it home to their partners and children. And I am weighing the risks I am willing to take to fight for justice. So this morning, what I have chosen to discuss with you is Howard Thurman, my favorite theologian, which I have mentioned from this pulpit before, and apparently one of John's also, and it makes a lot of sense. He was also one of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's favorites as well. In fact, it was his book, Jesus and the Disinherited, this book, that King carried around with him to every march, every protest, every witness across the American South. Howard Thurman in this book had a pretty powerful and simple message that he told in 5 chapters. And the first chapter is called Jesus, an Interpretation, and is deeply rooted in his moral and ethical teachings as a political revolutionary and activist who stood on the side of people who were marginalized and oppressed. Jesus was a Jew, part of the marginalized community in the Roman Empire. The following chapters in this book are titled Fear, Deception, Hate, and Love. And fear, he talks about the fear that is passed down generationally from one person to another that is within a group that has been terrorized, like the group to which Howard Thurman belonged and the group to which Martin Luther King Jr. belonged. Deception, he writes, is perhaps the oldest of all the techniques by which the weak have protected themselves against the strong. He goes on, the question of deception is not academic, but profoundly ethical and spiritual, going to the very heart of human relations. For it raises the issue of honesty, integrity, and the consequences thereof over and against duplicity and deception and the attendant consequences. He goes on to talk about deception as compromise rooted out of a need to simply survive, acknowledging the real and very true threats against lives when we speak truth in places where truth is not welcome. Hate, he says, cannot be defined, it can only be described. In fact, he describes it as contact without fellowship. Contact that is devoid of any of the primary overtures of warmth and fellow feeling and genuineness. He talks about hatred as if it is a virus that can spread easily from one person to another, especially when a person opens their mouth, spreading that hatred. He also regularly goes back to the dynamic that exists between weak and strong, because that power dynamic is always at play, whether we are aware of it or not. And from the perspective of those who are marginalized, he goes on to describe the kind of hatred that festers in hearts, because there it is safe to hate the people who condemn them, who terrorize, who belittle. But he says when hatred serves as a dimension of self-realization, the illusion of righteousness is easy to create. Often there are but thin lines between bitterness, hatred, self-realization, defiance, and righteous indignation, leading us to do things that we might claim are defensible, like what happened last week to Renee Good, even when they clearly are not. He is clear in this chapter that hatred does not discriminate against weak or strong. It can take root anywhere. Thurman ends the book on with a chapter on love. And he brings us back to Jesus and says that there is a central love ethic to Jesus' ministry and to the religion of Jesus, which he is clear is quite a different thing than Christianity. Christianity, which had been upholding white supremacy culture instead of lifting up those with their backs against the wall, those like his people who were in the throes of Jim Crow, like the Jews who were in the throes of Roman Empire. Jesus called on his people to love their neighbor, to love those outside the household of Israel, the Samaritan, the Roman, the tax collector. The religion of Jesus is one that is in essence about loving one another, including loving your enemy. He goes on to define love in the same way he defines hate. Hate is contact without fellowship. Love is contact with fellowship. Love is seeing one another in mutuality, that inescapable network, seeing one another as siblings. Thurman writes, no amount of good feeling for people in general, no amount of simple desiring is adequate. It is the act of inner authority, well within the reach of everyone. Obviously, then, merely preaching love of one's enemies, however high and holy, cannot accomplish this result. He says it takes painstaking discipline, which can only be made possible by personal triumph. He goes on the ethical demand upon the more privileged and the underprivileged is the same. When Thurman talks about weak and strong, privileged and underprivileged, he doesn't equate one with the other. It's not like weak is the privileged or underprivileged, or strong is the privileged or underprivileged. He says we each have a responsibility to cultivate that which we are called to do, which is to love one another, which is one heck of a big ask. And that is an inward journey. He calls it a personal triumph, something of the Spirit. And this book was first published in 1949, after Thurman had a mystical experience while visiting the Indian people and Mohandas Gandhi in 1936. The Indian people who suffered in a similar way to the people in a similar system to that of the black people in America under colonialism and under caste. Gandhi introduced Thurman to the Hindu concepts of ahimsa and satyagraha, which are nonviolence and firmness of truth. And nonviolence works in conjunction with the firmness of truth, that all people have inherent worth and dignity. It's based on the same idea that's present in this book about love, contact with fellowship. That reminds us to love our enemies, challenges us to wish no harm on any other human, even those who might wish to cause harm to us. And as we are bearing witness to the injustices around us, we may feel anger rise in us, but we must not let it fester into hatred. We may feel passion stir in us, and we cannot give it the power to turn into violence. Now, Unitarian Universalists are familiar with peace, love, and that first principle of inherent worth and dignity of all people. But I have said this before, and I'll say it countless times, knowledge is quite a different thing from practice. Because the words that we use and the actions that we take are expressions of what we have built inside. My most fervent prayer is that we can be honest with ourselves over the state of our own spirits and learn to be okay with the discomfort and challenge of that process. I pray that the actions we take in the public sphere are rooted in the power of the Spirit we cultivate within. The Spirit that hopes, looks for, and is willing to see the Spirit in all other people. The human spirit that transcends difference, that hopes for so much. One thing Howard Thurman was most clear on was that transformed people transform the world. He said it clearly in his book about love as an inward journey. If we can destruct the things that we've been taught about what others are or are not, if we can make space in our own hearts and souls to welcome each other in true fellowship, with full acceptance of the differences among us, which again is so much easier to say than to do, then we will truly be loving and we'll be that much closer to beloved community. The beloved community that Dr. King spoke so eloquently and passionately for. To the beloved community he died for.